I've never been one to meet up with people I connect with online. I've always been more reserved, the kind of person who prefers a quiet coffee with close friends over unexpected adventures. But that particular month, I was feeling a bit more open to new experiences. It was January, that strange time between New Year's and the return to work when everything feels a little suspended. I was scrolling through a dating app when I started chatting with a guy who seemed interesting. His name was Alex. He had a laid-back vibe, an easy laugh in his messages, and genuinely seemed interested in what I had to say. After a week of chatting, he suggested we meet in person. On a whim, I agreed. "Why don't you come over? We can order some food and watch a movie," I said, imagining a casual, no-pressure kind of date. The day of the date, I got everything ready. I tidied up the living room, lit a few candles to create a cozy atmosphere, and picked out a dress that was simple but made me feel good. Alex arrived promptly at 8, carrying a bottle of wine and a smile that, at first glance, seemed genuine. The first couple of hours went well. We talked about movies, laughed about our awkward app experiences, and started watching a thriller on TV. But at some point during the evening, things began to shift. I couldn't pinpoint exactly when it happened. Maybe it was the way he started looking at me too long, like he was trying to figure out something I wasn't saying. Or maybe it was how his responses became shorter, as if his mind was elsewhere. The light-hearted, relaxed vibe evaporated, replaced by a tension that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. The change in his behavior became more obvious when he started asking odd questions. "Do you always leave your door unlocked like that?" he asked out of nowhere as I was gathering our wine glasses. I thought it was strange but answered casually, "Only because I knew you were coming. Normally, I lock it." He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was unsettling. I tried to brush it off. When I returned to the living room, I noticed him staring intently at one of the candles, his eyes almost glowing in the flickering light. "Do you believe in energy?" he asked suddenly. Before I could answer, he started talking about how people carry negative charges that can affect others. The conversation veered into a bizarre, unsettling direction, and that's when I started to feel genuinely uncomfortable. I masked my discomfort and suggested it might be time to call it a night. "I think it's getting late. I have to get up early tomorrow," I said, hoping he'd take the hint. But Alex didn't seem inclined to leave. He leaned back on the couch as if settling in for the rest of the night. "Are you sure you want me to go now?" he asked, his tone less like a question and more like a challenge. My heart started to race. "Yes, I really do need to sleep," I insisted. He let out a low chuckle but didn't move. That's when I realized something was seriously wrong. My mind was racing. He wouldn't leave, and his presence started to feel oppressive. I tried to keep calm, or at least appear calm. I stood up and walked to the door, hoping he'd follow, but he stayed rooted to the couch, his eyes fixed on me in a way that made my skin crawl. "Alex, please. I mean it. It's time for you to go," I said more firmly, but he just tilted his head, like he was studying me. I decided to grab my phone discreetly and stepped into the hallway, but before I could call anyone, I heard him get up. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice laced with something cold and threatening. I quickly pocketed the phone and tried to maintain my composure. "Just checking some messages," I lied, but he didn't seem convinced. He took a step toward me, and my entire body froze. "You know, I thought you'd be more open," he said slowly, his words dripping with a deliberate menace. That was the last straw. I went back into the living room and, summoning all the authority I could muster, said, "Alex, you need to leave. Now!" He didn't respond. He just stood in the hallway, staring at me. That's when I knew there was no peaceful way to resolve this. As he lingered in the hallway, the air in the house felt heavier, like every breath was an effort. I couldn't let him see how terrified I was, so I went into my bedroom and locked the door, trying to steady my thoughts. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but my hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. Just as I dialed, I heard footsteps outside the door, followed by a soft knock. "Are you messing with me?" he asked, his voice low and chillingly controlled. My heart was pounding. I didn't answer, trying to quiet my breathing so he wouldn't hear how panicked I was. Suddenly, the knocking turned into loud bangs. "Open this door now," he shouted, his voice thunderous and filled with rage. I was so scared I could barely think straight. I scanned the room for a way out and saw the window. It was my only option. Without hesitation, I opened it and assessed the jump. It was the second floor, but there was grass below. Better to risk the fall than stay trapped with him. I heard the wood of the doorframe cracking as he tried to force it open, and that gave me the push I needed. I climbed onto the windowsill and jumped, bracing for impact. The fall left me dazed, but the adrenaline was stronger than the pain. Without looking back, I ran toward the front gate, only to find it locked. I remembered the key was inside the house, so I sprinted to the side yard, searching for another way out. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might burst, but I kept moving. I heard the sound of glass shattering upstairs and realized he was trying to break through the bedroom window. I didn't have much time. I found a small gap in the fence separating my yard from my neighbor's. It was tight, but I squeezed through, scratching my arms and legs in the process. Once in my neighbor's yard, I ran to their back door and pounded desperately, but no one answered. I made my way to the front of their house, where I saw lights on. I tried to call for help, but my voice was barely audible through the panic. When I reached the front door and started knocking frantically, it opened. My neighbor, an older man in his 70s, looked alarmed. "Please, help me. There's a man in my house," I begged. Without hesitation, he pulled me inside and locked the door. Inside, as the neighbor helped me calm down, I tried to explain what had happened. Before I could finish, loud banging erupted at his front door. My blood ran cold. It was Alex. "Open the door. She's crazy. You don't know who you're dealing with?" he yelled, his voice a mix of anger and desperation. The neighbor looked at me, clearly unsure for a moment, but the terror on my face must have convinced him. He grabbed his phone and called the police while leading me to a back room. Hearing Alex's shouts outside was horrifying, but the sound of police sirens approaching was the greatest relief I've ever felt. He tried to run, but they caught him quickly. I watched through the window as they handcuffed him and put him in the squad car, still screaming nonsense about how this isn't over. After he was taken away, the police escorted me back to my house to assess the damage. The living room was a mess. The bedroom window was completely shattered, but thankfully, nothing worse had happened. I later learned that Alex had a history of aggressive behavior, but I was never told the full details. Since that night, I've never invited anyone I don't know well into my home. The fear I felt that evening left a mark that still lingers. I've always been someone passionate about exploring the world on my own. That year, I was traveling through the countryside of a mountainous region I had always dreamed of visiting. It was late April, and spring made everything feel more alive. The trees bursting with green leaves, the scent of wildflowers in the air, and the sound of streams rushing in the distance. I had stopped in a small village with plans to hike to a viewpoint that was said to offer breathtaking views. Over breakfast at the inn, I opened a travel app to see if I could find someone who had done the trail before. That's how I met Mark. He seemed experienced, with photos of various adventures in remote places, and in his message, he suggested guiding me to a more secluded spot that he claimed was even more incredible. I hesitated at first. It wasn't like me to trust strangers so quickly, but Mark seemed friendly, even a little charming. He said he was a photographer and used these trails to capture nature in its purest form. That convinced me. Why not? I thought. We arranged to meet at the village square in the early afternoon. He was younger than I expected, maybe in his 30s, with a worn backpack and boots that showed signs of heavy use. He gave me a wide smile and said, "You won't regret this." At the time, I didn't realize how differently those words could be interpreted. The hike started off peacefully. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, and the shadows of the trees danced with every step we took. Mark was talkative, full of stories about his travels and adventures in remote areas. He described encounters with wild animals and unexpected situations with an infectious enthusiasm. For a moment, I let go of any initial doubts. We even took a few pictures together when we reached a small plateau overlooking a valley. He seemed so at ease in the environment that it gave me a sense of safety. But as the evening progressed, something in his behavior began to change. Mark suggested we stop for a bite to eat before continuing to a spot where he said it would be safe to camp. He pulled out some provisions from his backpack and offered me a piece of fruit and a sandwich. We ate as he talked about his plans to capture the sunrise from a cliff nearby. The food tasted slightly off, but I attributed it to the spices he used. Shortly after, I began to feel my vision blur and a wave of overwhelming fatigue wash over me. My legs felt heavy, and before I could question what was happening, everything went dark. The last thing I remember was the sound of Mark murmuring something, but I couldn't make out the words. I woke up to the biting cold against my skin, as if I were lying on ice. My head throbbed and my muscles felt like lead. When I finally opened my eyes, I realized I wasn't where we had stopped earlier. Darkness surrounded me, save for the faint glow of stars barely illuminating the dense forest. My backpack, phone, wallet, everything was gone. Mark was nowhere to be seen. For a moment, I thought I might be trapped in some strange nightmare, but the distant hoots of owls and the rustling of leaves in the wind harshly brought me back to reality. I struggled to my feet, groping at the ground for anything that might help me make sense of my surroundings. The only thing I found was a half-full water bottle, likely left behind by mistake. Panic began to take hold, but I forced my mind to focus on what I needed to do. I had no idea where I was, and my only option was to follow what appeared to be a faint trail. My legs trembled as I moved forward, the forest seeming to come alive with every snapping branch and rustling leaf, making my imagination conjure far worse than what had already happened. The overwhelming sense of vulnerability was crushing, but something inside me urged me to keep going. As I continued down the trail, the darkness seemed to swallow everything around me. My breathing became the only constant sound, and every step made my heart pound harder. Without any landmarks to guide me, I felt increasingly disoriented but pressed on. At one point, I heard footsteps not far away. I froze in place, gripping the water bottle as if it could serve as a weapon. "Mark?" I called out, my voice shaky. No response. The sound vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving me with the chilling certainty that I wasn't entirely alone. After what felt like hours of walking, I finally stumbled upon a small stream. The sound of flowing water was a relief, something familiar amidst the chaos. I decided to follow the stream, hoping it would lead me to some sign of civilization. As I walked, the sky began to lighten, the first rays of dawn piercing through the trees. That's when I spotted something on the ground. My backpack. It had been ransacked, with anything of value taken, but a few clothes and a map remained. With trembling hands, I grabbed the map and studied it, realizing I was several hours away from the village. It was the first glimmer of hope I'd had all night. With the map as my guide, I started heading toward the village. Exhaustion weighed heavily on me, but the thought of being closer to safety kept me moving. The sound of the stream accompanied my steps, and while every crack of a branch still made me turn my head, the growing daylight made me feel slightly less vulnerable. After hours of walking, I finally saw the rooftops of the village houses. The sight nearly brought me to my knees in relief. Once I reached the village, I went straight to the local police station and explained everything that had happened. The officer who took my statement was experienced, but couldn't hide the concern on his face. He told me that stories like mine weren't unheard of in the area. People lured onto remote trails, robbed, and left stranded in inaccessible locations, often by scammers posing as guides. Mark, if that was even his real name, had likely done this before. While they promised to investigate, they warned me it would be difficult to track him down. Despite that, I was grateful to be alive and to have made it out of such a terrifying situation. Since then, I've never trusted improvised plans with strangers during my travels. The experience left a mark on me that I carry to this day. When I moved to that neighborhood, I was looking for peace. I had just gotten divorced and thought that a quieter area, farther from the city, would be the perfect refuge to start fresh. It was a friendly neighborhood, full of well-kept gardens and a seemingly tight-knit community. To integrate myself, I downloaded an app where neighbors shared tips and promoted events. That's where I met Daniel. He commented on a post about how safe and pleasant the neighborhood was. We exchanged a few messages, and eventually, he showed up at my door with a smile that was just a little too big to feel casual. "I'm Daniel. I live 2 houses down. If you need anything, just let me know." At first, it seemed like a stroke of luck to have such a helpful neighbor. He would drop by occasionally, offering recommendations for local services or just to say hi. But over time, I noticed his visits became more frequent and always unannounced. He'd show up with simple excuses like asking for sugar or borrowing a tool. One time, he came holding a broken light bulb and asked if I had a spare. It felt odd, but I helped him anyway. Gradually, his kindness started to feel more like an intrusion. I'd come home from work and find Daniel in my yard, examining my plants or just waiting, as if it were completely normal. Things started to feel truly uncomfortable when he began coming into my house without knocking. One time, I was sitting on the couch watching TV when he opened the front door and walked in with a big smile, holding a toolbox. "I thought you might need help with something," he said without even asking for permission to enter. I tried to be polite but firm. I explained that I'd appreciate it if he let me know before coming over, but he just shrugged, acting like I was overreacting. I started locking my doors at all times, but that only seemed to make him more persistent. He'd knock repeatedly, sometimes for minutes on end, until I finally gave in and opened the door. Then, on a Friday night, things escalated. I was exhausted from a long week at work and just wanted to relax. I had taken a shower, changed into pajamas, and was settling in for a quiet evening when I heard his familiar knock at the door. I ignored it. I waited, thinking he'd go away, but instead, I heard the sound of the doorknob turning. My heart raced. I got up and went to the door, only to find Daniel standing outside, peering in as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Didn't you hear me knocking? I need to show you something," he said, his expression a mix of irritation and insistence. When I explained that it was late and I wanted to be alone, he simply replied, "Oh, I don't care about the time," and walked in. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen, trying to process what was happening. Daniel acted like he was in his own home, strolling into the kitchen and opening the fridge. "You don't have anything good in here, huh?" he commented, as if it were a casual visit. My patience was wearing thin. I took a deep breath and said, "Daniel, I've told you before that you need to let me know before coming over. Now, please leave." He turned around slowly, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Come on, we're neighbors. Why are you treating me like a stranger?" he said, but there was something off in his tone, almost like a challenge. When I insisted he leave, the atmosphere became tense. He crossed his arms and stood in the middle of the living room, staring at me as if testing how far I'd go. My heart was pounding, but I kept my voice steady. "Daniel, I'm serious. You need to leave now." He shook his head as if disappointed and said something that sent a chill down my spine. "You should be more careful about how you talk to people. Sometimes that can backfire." At that moment, I realized this wasn't just about discomfort anymore. This was something much more dangerous. Trying not to show the panic rising inside me, I picked up my phone and said, "If you don't leave right now, I'm calling the police." Daniel laughed, but it was a dry, humorless laugh. "The police? That's dramatic. You really don't understand how a good neighborhood works, do you?" He took another step toward the couch and sat down as if the house were his. That was the final straw. I dialed the number, and as the phone started ringing, he suddenly stood up, slapping his forehead lightly as if he'd just remembered something. All right, I'm leaving," he said, raising his hands in an exaggerated gesture of surrender. But before he walked out the door, he turned to me, that strange, unsettling smile back on his face. "You know, we don't get to choose our neighbors, but I'm the type who likes to stay close. Really close." He left before I could respond, closing the door with an eerie level of care. As soon as I heard the lock click, I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath. My whole body was trembling, and I realized that even though he was gone, the fear still lingered like a shadow. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, sitting on the couch with all the lights on and every door bolted. Every little noise outside felt amplified. I kept looking out the window, expecting to see him again, but thankfully, the street remained empty. The next morning, I went straight to the local police station to file a report. I explained everything in detail, from his odd behavior to his refusal to leave my house. The officer who took my statement listened carefully but didn't seem surprised. "You're not the first to complain about Daniel," he said, jotting down notes. I learned that other neighbors had reported invasive behavior from him, though nothing as extreme as what I'd experienced. Based on my complaint, the police decided to confront him. Later that day, a neighbor told me they had seen officers at Daniel's house, taking him in for questioning. They discovered he had a history of obsessive behavior and even some charges of trespassing in another neighborhood before moving to ours. I felt a mix of relief and unease. He didn't return to the neighborhood after that day, but the experience left me on edge. To this day, I keep my doors locked at all times, and unexpected visitors still make me anxious. Daniel may be gone, but the fear he left behind still lingers.